Hello everyone, this is Ben, that guy with a French accent, and today I wanted to talk to you about a subject that I skimmed in another video, which I call the Lake Geneva game session. The way I played game with Ernie Gygax as a game master, and the way I'm told the sessions were played of Castle Greyhawk with Gary and Rob Kuntz and all that, have something that's a little particular structure of their own, which might help some gamers out there to get their campaign off the ground and to keep them running, and to provide perhaps new ways to play the game that they haven't thought about. So I'm gonna get inside the topic right away and show you a schematic I drew of the typical game session in Lake Geneva, right? Generally, you start the game at game start, like in the home base, in the village where the adventurers come from. Then, after they organize themselves, they leave the village and go through the wilderness where some encounters might occur and end up at the dungeon, where they explore parts that they either didn't explore before, or that they push further than they did before, or whatever the case, and find out how the dungeon changed in the meantime, and so on. And at some point, whether when their resources are depleted, where they hit significant treasure that makes the game session for them, or they simply run out of time in real time for the game session, at some point the party must decide to retreat from the dungeon to make its way back through the wilderness where more encounters can happen, and then finally end up at the end of the game session back at the village. And that's actually the point that is important here. That is that the game session has a pattern where it starts and ends at the village, at the home base of the player characters. Now we're going to go into each step, and I intend to make some further videos about each step here and to take them apart and go about preparing for them and running them. First, we're going to go through the start of the game, where the players are welcomed at the table, right? And you will have a variety of players who are regular of the games and some who might not be, right? The referee typically will ask, what characters are you playing this week? And so the players will agree with each other, like playing characters that mesh well together, hopefully. And you'll find out that you will have your core of regulars who will have their characters, with new players who don't have a character at all, and maybe some players who play more often than others that have a character that are too high level. The new players, you just ask them to create the characters right then and there. That shouldn't take more than half an hour. And to create a character at the lower end of the level discrepancy between the highest level and the lowest level characters in the party, right? So given that the original and advanced games are what they are, if you don't fudge the dice, if you don't cheat on the players to make them win, rising to a level about 5-6 is actually quite an accomplishment. Especially if you're a newbie, you never played the Dungeons & Dragons game before. In the meantime, you should have plenty of characters that are gonna die. And when you make it to what's called the super heroic levels, above level 8, and the name levels, then that's a serious accomplishment for the players. There must be plenty of characters who are in the cemetery by then. All that to say that for the generally when the game begins, parties will be generally in the single digit levels, generally around level 5-6, rarely above, right? So levels of beginner characters, new players coming to the table, can be as low as level 1, and will usually be level 1, unless the characters are above level 4, level 5, 6, 7, then you can start thinking, of asking newbies to create level 2, level 3 characters. Level 4 characters might be a maximum. Because the way the XP tables are built, those levels are going to equalize each other, right? The more the party adventures together, and the more the levels are going to flatten in terms of discrepancy, because of the amount of XP that it takes to get from one level to the next. And those players who have really would like to play solo, who play every week, will have generally very high level characters. And those guys, if they play with other players who are not as often there as they are, you might want them to play henchmen of their primary character, or hirelings that become level 1 characters in the game. And that creates the secondary characters in what we call the stables of characters. So that experienced players in the campaign will usually have several characters. And given that groups of about 4 levels in discrepancy generally work well together, you won't have that many characters in an experienced player's stable. You will have four characters maximum, 5 maximum, great maximum, more usually 2 or 3, right? And those 2 or 3 characters will cover most of the gamut of levels. One will be level 3, another one will be level 7, and the primary will be level 10 or something like that. But you want to have dozens upon dozens of characters, unless you let players create as many characters as they want, which you can do, since only those that are played gain experience, right? So that's not really a problem. All right. So once that's done, once you have your players and your characters, the players then decide on an objective in the game, right? What to do this game session. Well, unless there is something going on in the village that requires their attention, you, referee, might want to throw them a curveball. There's been a boating accident. Who died and why? There are bandits sighted in the region. Are they going to investigate those sightings? Those kind of events. There's an invasion. The orcs invade the village. It's classic. We must repeal the invasion. Bon. So that adds some texture to the world and to the going on in the world. And most of these events, not all, but most, might go back ultimately to the dungeon when they are investigated. So that, all the roads lead to Rome, ultimately, right? The pole of evil in your campaign, that's the dungeon. All right. So, otherwise, most often, what's going to happen is that the players will decide themselves what they want to do. And that has to do with going back to the dungeon. That is, last week, remember when you turn right and we didn't turn left, there were stairs going down left. Yes, we might want to look into that and go down and see what's going on there. What about the idol that we found last time? We might ask about the symbols we took down on paper to a sage. They go to a sage in the village and ask for questions about what that means. Maybe that's going to reveal a puzzle or something. So that's how you want the players to take control of their own situations and prepare to say, what do we do once we hit the dungeon, right? Occasionally, especially when the party becomes solidified after a few sessions and it gets an identity of its own, it's known in the campaign world, your players might start to decide to take care of stuff outside the dungeon and to build a fort for the village, to create their own domain once they start hitting a name level and so on, right? But these are goals, long-term goals that are perfectly fine to follow, and so as the campaign goes on, the players will probably diversify their options, and that's a good thing. All right. So once they decided what they want to do, they have to go to the dungeon. They're not there yet, so they're gonna have to go through the wilderness. And on their way there, they're going to go through the variety of terrain and all that, which the map that you designed with the hexes and the types of terrain between the home base and the dungeon should be there to help you out. And depending on the time of day, time of night, you make a check to see if there is an encoder on the way. The encoders, well, there's 2, 3 possibilities of encoders, are important, because this is where the time factor and the resource factor comes into play. If you have a party that refuses to parley, doesn't know when to evade an encoder, insists on fighting anything on its way to the dungeon, those are that many more resources that the party is spending before even hitting the door of the dungeon. And that will matter once they're in the dungeon and are facing problems or opponents that are tough to crack, right? And all that compounds, you will see in the end of the session, to create a natural order or a natural timing in which the party itself might want to choose to retreat, as opposed to the referee saying, oh, it's getting late, maybe you might want to quit the dungeon, right? So these random encoders will be the first events on the way to adventure. And once that the party makes it through the wilderness, right, then they're in the dungeon. And in the dungeon, that's where they get back to the point of their objectives, right? So what about getting down those stairs and investigating what happens? What about this idol? As they do that, things will happen. Encounters will be triggered, they're checked and triggered, events might happen, NPCs might show up, an opposite adventuring party might show up. That's up to the referee, the tables, and whatever their imagination conjures, which makes the game in the dungeon alive. What you don't want, and the reason for these encounters checks and all that, is for the party to feel like they can stay there. They can take all their time to investigate things. If you're using the rules as they're presented to you in the original and advanced games, parties cannot do this. They can't stay forever in front of a fresco wondering what it means. Because each exploration turn, there's a chance to trigger a serious encounter. And when that happens, that becomes a problem. That becomes a major event, actually, in the session. Because that depletes that much more resources. And sooner or later, resources are going to become scarce. The hope for the party, investigating what they didn't before, and going where they haven't gone before, is to hit some form of treasure before they leave the dungeon. Because when you calculate the XP that average parties earn exploring dungeons, you realize that most parties don't earn their XPs on killing monsters. That represents, in fact, only about a quarter to a third of the XP the party earns. The party will earn the biggest chunks, by the book, of their XP on gaining treasure and securing it out of the dungeon, which matters with this format of gameplay. Alright? So, then, when finally they run out of resources, the cleric doesn't have any spells. The fireballs are scarce. They have maybe several characters that are near 0 HP, or maybe some are dead already. Then it's seriously time to think about retreating from the dungeon. Sleeping in a cell in a dungeon might be an option in an emergency, but you don't gain any XP from the treasure you have. So if you spend your time between sessions in a cell, in the dungeon, you start at the same point you left the game last time, which is without much resources. Your equipment is gone, or whatever equipment, expendable equipment you used on the way. Those are the torches, iron spikes, and so on and so forth. So, at some point, you will have to decide to leave the dungeon. And the best organic way to do this, that's at the end of the real-world game session. you back off from the dungeon, and you have to travel back to the village, which again can trigger the encounters along the way. So if you wait the last moment, no resources left, to make your way back to home to secure your treasure, you might make an encounter that creates a total particular, a TPK on the way. So you got all this aspect of strategy and tactics, deciding when to push in the dungeon, when not to push, trying to avoid the monster, not to avoid the monster, parley maybe, and so on, right? So, and that's an aspect that some players may get bored by this, don't like to count resources. Others will love it. Others are actually playing the game for this very reason. I'm one of those players who loves to be facing tactical choices, and who plays Dungeons Exploration in part because of this, right? And that in a make-believe of the mind, you can create tactical situations that you would never be able to have playing a computer game or whatever. And when you mix in the role-playing elements, that creates the magic that is Dungeons and Dragons in my mind. So, at the end of the session, after all this, they must be in the village. You can separate the treasure between them. They can identify treasure, which then makes them earn the treasure XP. They cannot gain their XP if they have not secured the dungeon back at the hometown. And that's a key, and that's in the original and advanced Dungeons and Dragons game, Dungeon Master's Guide. And that's is key to this type of gaming. So, to get back to our beginning, this explains this type of format of session, where we go out there from the village, starts at the village. Any player can show up between 1 week to the next. You don't have to ask your players, I need the exact same players to be able to go on the campaign. No. You can have any player showing up, new or regular. Then you fill in the spots, ask them what character are you playing, and you go on the cycle until at the end of the session they get back to the village, get their XP, and you can start the next game with some of the same characters, different characters, new players, whatever. And that's how that works in that context. So in further videos later, we're gonna plunge deeper into all this, and we're gonna try to take everything apart to see how to optimize the making of these components and run them in the game. Because I think that might be key for some people to really have a lot of fun with the game out there. Maybe they didn't know about it. Maybe they're wondering how to organize all this. So we're gonna go through all this, and it's gonna be useful for gamers, I hope. Until then, you have a good gaming, and we'll talk later. Bye bye.